So for those I haven't met before, my name's Justin Boulanger. I'm the knowledge broker for NRM Regions Australia's National Biosecurity Hub project. Before we go any further, can I just please make an acknowledgement of country? So Kaya, Wanju, Bibliman, Menang, Noongar Boodja. Um, I'm joining you from Menang and Bibliman country on the south coast of Western Australia today. I'd like to express my gratitude for the custodianship that First Nations people have in the past given for the lands that we all live, work, and play on, and for the ongoing contribution that current and future First Nations people continue to make towards that custodianship. And I invite you, if you wish to do so, to share the particular countries, First Nations countries that you are joining from today. Um, can I please acknowledge, before we get started, Sergeant Trish for their work in terms of convening today's webinar, and also thanks to everyone that has joined us, whether you're from the NRM sector or from outside of the sector. We really appreciate you making time for today's webinar. A few rudimentary housekeeping matters. As you will have noticed, the session is being recorded. We are getting a number of people who are watching these webinars on our YouTube channel after the live stream. So it is providing a really useful avenue for other people to catch up. So hopefully that is okay with everyone. Can you please mute yourselves unless you are asking a question later on in the Q&A, just to avoid any background noise? That would be great. We would like you to indicate where you are from. So if you can rename your handle with the three dots in the corner of your feed, you'll be able to make sure that both your name is correct, but also if you can indicate where you're from, that would be fantastic. And then finally, we ask you if you can use the chat for any questions that come to mind through the course of the presentations. We do have a good amount of time at the end for Q&A. So if you have something you want to ask, please feel free to drop it into the chat. If you don't feel you can get it typed in quick enough, then feel free to put your hand up virtually and come off mute in the Q&A session, which will be after the last of the presentations we have. Today's webinar is about both the negative and the positive things that can happen sometimes unintentionally when conducting biosecurity activities. This was a topic area that the biosecurity community of practice identified in one of our surveys that we asked you to do earlier in the project. So we're really hopeful that today's presentations meet what your expectations are in terms of this topic area. I know that we shared this during the advertising material that we sent out for today's webinar, but unfortunately, due to some scheduling issues, we had to defer a presentation on invasive ants. But there's a lot of interest in this topic area, both in terms of perverse outcomes, but also just more broadly in terms of managing invasive ants. So in early 2026, we're going to do a webinar just dedicated specifically to invasive ant management. So for those of you that were really keen to hear about that, we ask you for a little bit of patience because we will get to that next year. But in terms of today's webinar, we have presentations from Rob Davis, who's the Associate Professor of Wildlife Conservation at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia, and he's going to talk about the impact of rodenticides on wildlife. Just our quick apologies. We originally identified also this was going to be specifically about raptors, but Rob's going to do a broader presentation about all wildlife. So there's going to be reptiles and mammals, and amphibians and birds. So yeah, hopefully that broader topic area is of it still obviously will be great. Thanks, Rob. Tom Nagle, who is the Priority Landscapes Program Lead with South Coast Natural Resource Management, and Heather Barnes, who is Bush Heritage Australia's Healthy Landscapes Manager, both in the southwest of Western Australia, are going to talk to us about the nexus of cat, fox, and rabbit control. So thank you in advance for that. And then finally, we're going to end on a sort of a positive story delivered by Peter Ridgeway. So Peter's the team leader of biodiversity with the Greater Sydney Local Land Services in New South Wales, and he leads large-scale restoration programs on grassy box woodland ecosystems. And he's going to talk about the positive ecosystem consequences of controlling invasive native blackthorn. So they're the three presentations that we have. So without further ado, I'm firstly going to hand over to Rob from Edith Cowan, who's going to talk about the control of rodents and what unintended consequences there can be for wildlife. So Rob, over to you.
Right. Well, good morning, all. Thanks for the opportunity to chat to you today. Yeah, as was indicated by Justin with the title change, we originally started our journey looking at how rat and mouse baits impact birds of prey, particularly owls. And kind of like a bomb going off, we quickly realized this issue cuts so much deeper through the entire ecosystem. So hopefully today you'll learn a little bit about those impacts and can consider them in your biosecurity actions that you might undertake. So just acknowledging my co-author and probably the brains behind a lot of this initiative was Dr. Michael Law, who was my PhD student at Edith Cowan University and has now graduated. And together we continue to promote this issue and do research in this area. So I'm just going to start with the pretty simple question. A lot of the focus of my talk is on anticoagulant rodenticides, often abbreviated to ARs. So, as the name might suggest, these are things that they stop the blood clotting. So, they actually make the animal bleed out. It's not very pleasant, but that's what we do when we use these products. So, it blocks the synthesis of vitamin K in the body, and it causes those animals to bleed out. Now, the other little terminology that you'll hear that we use quite a lot are the first generation and second generation products. So, first generation was simply the first ones to be invented by industry. And these are generally considered a bit better for wildlife because they do break down relatively quickly, but they do need multiple feeds by the rodents. And some rodents started developing resistance. So that spurred chemical companies to develop a second, more toxic, I guess, bait, which we call the second generation products. So they're a bit of a mouthful, but these are the universally accepted terms for them. And it's these second generation ones, as you'll hear from me, that we're mostly concerned about. And the reason is they have a much longer half-life. So we're talking persistence times of nearly a year in some studies, but certainly many months compared to maybe days to a week or two for the first generation products. A single feed is lethal, which is why consumers prefer them. But this raises the issue of, these very toxic dying rats and mice walking around with these poisons that have a very long half-life, leading to this walking dead conundrum where you could affect other wildlife. So the impacts of wildlife we'll be talking about today. So there are both primary and secondary exposures. I won't talk about primary exposure so much, but it's sort of obvious to say that any wildlife that eats these baits is at great risk, including pets and children. So these are very dangerous products. There is potential for impacting the human food chain, and that has been seen a number of times, both in Australia and overseas. And although we have strict monitoring in place, it remains a risk with second generation products. And also the animals are impacted at a sublethal level. So we can see things like increased rates of predation on animals impacted by these rodenticides, and perhaps an increase in accidents like roadkill as a result. And there's a lot more work to be done, but there's some evidence overseas that suppressed immune systems are a problem, and this might make animals sick even before they die of these products, and things like an increase in parasite load as well. So just onto the regulation of these products. So the second generation products are actually quite highly regulated in most of the Western world. In the US, Canada, and much of the EU, licensed pesticide applicators are the only people that can purchase and use these products. They are only registered generally for indoor use, and you require locked bait boxes that you see there. Now, my then student Mike is actually from the States, and he was rather shocked coming to Australia about the fact that his kids could walk into Bunnings and buy these products, which was certainly not be dreamt of in the US. Although, as he said, it's probably fair criticism leveled at him that people can go and buy guns in the US, but not bait. We'll leave that for greater discussion. But either way, those are quite well regulated. However, in Australia, that's not the case. Nothing is regulated to the consumer in this space. So there's a picture from Bunnings, where generally three first generation and up to five second generation products are available. These are currently, there is currently a review by the APVMA that I'll leave for another day because I've been very involved in the pushback against this and a call to ban these second generation products. But that review has been delayed 5 times so far, and we are awaiting an outcome in which we are calling for a ban on the sale to consumers of the second generation products. But that's for another time over some beers, I think, that discussion. Before I talk about this slide, I just wanted to say, acknowledging the context of today, we are very much in favour of the use of these products for things like island eradications. Rats are the number one cause of extinction of birds in the Pacific Islands, for example, worldwide. And the extinction rates on those islands are 10,000 times the normal background rate. So it is very difficult to eradicate things using alternative products. So we definitely want to state up front today that there is a strong role for the professional use of these products, but even in those settings, you do have secondary impacts, and those need to be considered and controlled. We're not advocating for a total ban, but much of what I talk about today is trying to restrict consumer use and be more sensible. So this slide just paints a picture of all the current research that we kind of kicked off in 2018 with Mike's PhD, and pleased to say that there has been quite a bit since then. And I'll talk specifically about a few of these studies. So the ones in white are the ECU-led studies from my lab, and the others are from some of the other labs, notably at Deakin University, where there's been some really good work on possums and owls as well. So this is definitely an area that has expanded significantly in recent times. But onto the study, I guess that tipped it all off. We did a review back in 2018 when Mike started up on what exactly was known about poisoning in Australia. This issue is front and center in Europe and North America, and we were pretty surprised not to see much there. So just looking at the existing grey literature, a lot of it from NRM groups and land managers, there was already concern and some documentation of declines of owls and records of poisoning in things such as little eagles, which is actually from Pindone, and then masked owls and 5 other species in Tasmania. But there had been no rigorous testing of wildlife in Australia at that point. So we undertook this review paper on the situation in Australia, and I'm happy to send these to anyone, and some of them you may find as open access online. But we followed that review pretty quickly by a specific study on the boobook owl, Australia's most common owl species, and we looked at those around Perth and the southwest. And the results of this were pretty concerning. So we've found 73% of the boobook owls had levels of moderate to severe poisoning by anticoagulant rodenticides, particularly Brodifacoum, the most widely used one. And so you can see for yourself in that pie chart there that only sort of just over a quarter of the owls had pretty much no or very low levels. And some of them had extremely high levels that almost certainly resulted in their death from bleeding out. So this was around 80 owls that we looked at for these analyses. So this certainly sparked a lot of concern, and Mike published that as part of his PhD study. And so I guess the outcome of this was that exposure to these second generation products was pretty common in the most common owl and likely impacting populations. We certainly theorised we probably underestimated lethal exposure in these studies, and we don't know about things like sublethal exposure affecting the health of animals. And given these owls potentially move large distances, there's possibly impacts across quite a broad regional level. So after that study, just a very quick look at some work that was undertaken looking at the rodents themselves. We've actually looked at the question of whether rodents in Australia are developing resistance to the products we use, like we see in other countries. So one study on mice sampled the Perth metropolitan area and Browse Island in the Kimberley, which is important because it's got a long isolated population of mice, so it provided a nice background. But the interesting thing, we did not find any evidence of mutations or resistance developing in mice in either of those locations. So hopefully, mice, we don't need to use these nasty second generation products. They are still killed by the first generation products. Just moving on quickly to another study we did that really opened our eyes. We decided to look at reptiles, having moved on from the birds. And you can see for yourself there two of the common snake species in the southwest, the dugite and the tiger snake. Dugite, 91% of them had detectable to high levels of brotificum. And surprisingly, the tiger snake, because they're a frog eater, they don't really eat rats and mice very much. And then the bobtail, which we all know and love, or shingleback lizard, as far as we're aware, it's not eating rats and mice at all. So there's other pathways of exposure into our reptiles. The bad news continued. We had a record and recently published a paper on the detection of these products in Carnaby's black cockatoo, which was found bleeding from the beak by Perth Zoo vets. We're able to analyse that and found the presence of two second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. We don't know if it was deliberate poisoning or incidental, but clear evidence it affects non-target species. Um, just this is in a timeline order rather than grouped. So recent study on rats now, are they developing resistance after we did the work on mice? Samples from 5 cities across Australia by ECU master student Alicia Gorbold. And what she did find, and this paper is now published, open access, is that the bad news is there is developing resistance in Australia. About 53% of black rats showed resistance to anticoagulant rodenticides. So there is concern that even these really nasty products are not actually working anyway. So I take the view, let's not use them if they're not at that effective anyway. Really quick look at our most recent study. Unfortunately, we have now turned our efforts to mammals and we looked at Australia's most threatened mammals, the quolls and the Tasmanian devil, and we found widespread exposure in these as well. As you can see from the graph, basically everything there that's yellow, orange, and red is not good news. So we have found that pretty much every species had some exposure and some of them reasonably high. The western quoll or Chuditch had the highest known levels of any mammal in the world. We found around 1.7 milligrams per kilogram in a quoll that ended up dying in Perth. And the normal pretty high rate is around zero point 0.5. So it's more than 3 times the lethal limit. Um, I won't go through all of this in detail, but this is just showing you some predictions we made of the percentage of the populations of some of these threatened species that are actually impacted by these products. So we're seeing that potentially 20 to 40% of some of these threatened mammals, the population is being reduced by that much in areas where there's rodenticide exposure. And this conceptual diagram is really just to indicate, as biologists, we talk a lot about all these things that affect populations. We've got fire, ferals, disease, climate change, and they will impact adult survival, juvenile survival in populations, and ultimately population viability. But I'm suggesting that we need to think a lot more about rodenticides as not only a cause, but perhaps the dominant impact on populations. As our data indicates there in red, we're seeing some pretty significant impacts on populations from this that might actually outstrip all of those causes. So I'll let that sink in. I'm arguing that yes, for some populations, predation may be less of an issue than rodenticide exposure. That goes against the norms, but definitely encourage all of you to think about this when you're undertaking rodent control activities. The common question I'm asked is about the available products. So the first generation products, coumatetrol and warfarin, we virtually never detect in any significant levels in any of the wildlife that we assay. They're pretty good to use, and I'm happy to say that. The second generation products there in red, all bad. Brodifacoum, the most widely used, it is our main problem that we keep detecting. And there's a couple of new products available, non-anticoagulant, different mechanisms, ray rodent specific, including rat sac naturals. There's not a lot of evidence yet on their broad scale use and efficacy, but I definitely advocate them for home use and some trials for broader use. So just getting to the end, what's next? These things affect more than just animals. So we're actually doing some research on human exposure, and we're keen to do some research on exposure in pets, on the introduced cane toad, which eats a lot of rats and mice. We're pushing for a nationwide monitoring program. And there's been some really positive trends, such as the owl-friendly movement that's now spread to a whole bunch of different shires. And we're pushing the Commonwealth government and states to list rodenticide as a key threatening process. And I know I've got to wrap up, Justin. This is my last slide. This is just, it can be quite depressing doing this work, just to say that citizen science has really come to the fore, and we're seeing now a lot of these local councils, we're seeing a lot of media coverage about the issue. I was lucky enough to be on the news about this, and that precipitated a big increase in awareness. And we're now seeing this owl-friendly movement, citizen-driven movement to try and ban these rodenticides in local areas. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to some questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Trish, if you didn't see it in your pop-up, so Trish added a link to one of the papers that you referenced in the chat, and we can also make them available on NRM Regions Australia's online knowledge hub for anyone who might be interested. So, if you're interested in those papers, please have a look there. So we're now going to hear from Tom Nagle from South Coast NRM and Heather Barnes from Bush Heritage Australia in a tag team presentation about integrated control of cats, foxes, and rabbits, and how this can be balanced to mitigate perverse outcomes. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you, Rob. That was a fantastic presentation. So yeah, g'day, Tom Nagle, South Coast NRM. I'm just a few doors down the road from Justin, actually. So make an acknowledgement of a similar acknowledgement to country that he did. Extend into a little bit more detail, just to set the scene for you here on the south coast of Western Australia. What you're looking at there is the two major native title and Illawarra holder groups here in the south. Quite interesting that we have both a prescribed body corporate in Esperance with determined native title, and then a peak organisation over in the west, Wargle Kep, that's been formed through the southwest settlement, which is quite a unique situation here in the southwest that Heather and I both operate in. That southwest settlement took a long time to come through, and in the decades while that was happening, there's a huge amount of grassroots Aboriginal organisations that we work with here in the region, and you're looking at some of their logos on the screen. And so for us, when we give an acknowledgement, we like to tell a bit of a story about this part of the world to show that we're quite actively trying to find meaningful partnerships with Aboriginal people across this landscape, across a variety of scales of organisations as well. If you've never heard of the south coast of Western Australia or the Fitzsterling, then you may have been living under a bit of a conservation rock, but that's okay. I'll give you a little bit of a screenshot here from our friends at Gondwana Link, who have been looking at this landscape in terms of landscape scale conservation activity for a long time. So there's nothing new in this part of the world about looking broadly at the landscape and trying to manage the extensive values that are here in what is quite a modified landscape as well. And we're also home to one of the very few biospheres in Australia, the Fitzgerald Biosphere region, and you're looking at a map of that. The Fitzgerald Biosphere is one of the most biodiverse sections of a very biodiverse region, and is recognised globally for that. So what I am going to talk to you about now is what this green line, this green polygon means, and how it relates to the work that Heather and Bush Heritage and a lot of other people are doing on the ground in sort of frontline conservation in this region. So what you're looking at there is the Fitz-Stirling priority place boundary. Many of you may have heard of priority places. If you haven't, priority places are a relatively new conservation vernacular. They stem from the Threatened Species Action Plan that's current at the moment. And they're a designation. So here's a map that shows there are 20 priority places nationwide. Some are islands, some are arid, some are well and truly offshore. That's us down the bottom there with the N. So that's the Fitz-Stirling region of Western Australia. And so the priority place concept is really quite a handy one, I think, for the work that we do in the NRM space, because it forces us to look at the whole landscape, not just zone in on particular species or particular ecological communities that might be in strife, but let's look at the entire landscape surrounding these. Let's look at all the players in terms of organizations that we can partner with, and let's look at all the different tenure that make up this landscape and try to have an impact and work across all those tenures. And you'll hear Heather and I both talk about this idea of working tenure blind that we'll both get into more detail. So yeah, one of 20 priority places. It's just a 2-year initial investment, which we're in the final stretch of now. And the focus is on 5 threatened species and 2 threatened ecological communities. So today we're just going to talk really about the integrated pest management. It's one of the really big ticket items of the Fitz-Stirling Priority Place project. However, as I'm sure you can appreciate, there's a huge amount of work happening in addition to pest management, work with Noongar groups on cultural fire, threatened flora work, translocations, establishment of ex situ populations, lots of monitoring, and a huge amount of partnerships across the region. But like I said, today we're really going to hone in on the integrated pest management, which is one of the many ways we're having a meaningful impact across the landscape on this project. So there's a few familiar but not so lovable faces right there. So what does integrated pest management mean? Well, it means a few things, and it's also quite region specific. So what you're looking at here inside the now yellow Fitz-Stirling Priority Place polygon is the footprint of last financial year's integrated pest management. So this is where the Saving Native Species money through this priority place has been channeled out to a huge amount of partner organisations in the region, all represented by the different coloured spatial mapping there. And so that's what you're looking at there is baiting, trapping, shooting, follow up, multiple applications on the same properties. Some of those are conservation properties, and some are active agricultural and pastoral landscape as well. Heather and Bush Heritage have a number of properties right in this central zone. You probably can't see my cursor, but it's right in the middle of all of those brown polygons, which she'll really zoom into. So integrated pest management to us means a bunch of different players applying a bunch of different pest management applications in addition to each other across the landscape. Here's a map that just shows you where all of the different land care groups and special interest groups and agricultural groups and grower groups exist in the landscape. And at South Coast, we really actively engage in those partnerships to get federal environmental investments spread out across the region. Integrated also means working in close collaboration with the state Parks and Wildlife Service, so DBCA, and they have their own pest management regime as well called Western Shield. So what you're looking at here is their Western Shield baiting, and it's covering basically, as you'd expect, the main national parks and reserves. So if I just flick back a couple of slides, you look at where the Saving Native Species Priority Place money is hitting the ground, and then a couple of slides forward again, and we look at the DBCA one. What you're starting to see here is a large landscape scale, cross tenure, all players talking to each other. And that's one of the roles that South Coast is playing, is bringing all these players together twice a year in an integrated pest management steering committee to share information, look to see where we're having best effect, look at some of the most cutting edge science, and learn from each other and communicate. Before I hand over to Heather for a little bit more detail on the work that Bush Heritage are doing in this space, I just thought I'd show you this slide. It's some images and a poster from. I mentioned we work closely with catchment groups and local land care groups and farmer groups, channeling some of this money out there. And some of the great things that they do with this is host these local shoot events. They're a really important community event in an agricultural landscape. There's a huge amount of social and cultural flow-on benefits from things like this that bring the community together. And some of the numbers that they achieve in a single night of volunteer hours is quite staggering. If you can see the tally in orange on one of those panels, you're looking at 153 foxes, 69 rabbits, and 26 cats just in a single night of shooting, which is some impressive numbers, and it all, the amalgamation of which it's all having a good effect on the landscape. So Heather, I'll chip over to you now, and if you just want to give me a little thing, and I'll keep rolling the slides for you.
Okay, no worries. Great. So I guess Tom's already alluded to the properties that we're working to. But if you see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a Fitzgerald River National Park, and on the left is the Stirling Range National Park. So Bush Heritage owns the properties in orange, and we work in partnership across the properties in yellow and blue to actually go outside of our tenure and operate this program, but we also partner up to do restoration projects as well. So we're looking at connectivity through the landscape there to try and build a macro corridor across this area. Next slide. Okay. I guess the title slide is that it's called the Fauna Recovery Project because it was initiated back in 2020 through a huge Lotteries West grant, covered 5 years, which is an amazing length of time to really dig in and get some ground. And there was a whole heap of people that are involved in getting this project going, but also in its delivery. So we've talked about integrated pest management, multiple controls across a number of species, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what we did. Landscape scale, so we're not just talking about 1 or 2 properties, but we are really trying to branch out in the bush heritage scale area, but also, as Tom alluded to, across the broader landscape. Tenure blind in terms of not just one particular owner or land manager, but working together to really get best bang for our buck, so that we can work with our local neighbours and across those boundaries to really work together to produce a much more effective outcome over a larger area. So 26 properties. Strategic and targeted. So I'll talk a bit about the way we try to target what we do and be strategic, but really understanding where those invasive species are, I guess, becoming a problem in the landscape and where to target them. So there's been a lot of work going into how to target these particular species. Collaborative and community-based. So I think Tom's already touched on this, but working with community, listening to community, and getting tools that are most effective for not just them, but across a bigger landscape. So next slide. When we say fauna recovery, these are the sorts of things that we're looking to see recover. Some of these are, threatened because of landscape scale clearing in the southwest. And some of that clearing we can't necessarily completely undo, but we can certainly protect the remnants and build corridors of what's left. So keep slide. Yep. So this is just an example of the sorts of baiting programs that we were doing. And when I say target and strategic, we started using gantries to start with. In conversations with our neighbours, it was thought that there's some hesitation around using baits, particularly when there's working dogs in the area. So we were very carefully developing, trust, and using gantries is a way to do that. It is quite labour intensive. So over 400 gantries in this area. And I should say, in addition to that, those two big blocks of bush, they were aerially baited during this time as well. Another great thing about using gantries is you can actually you obviously change out the fresh baits and you can actually see what's been taken. And sometimes you get different proportions of uptake in different types of seasons. And you can vary what baits you put out and you can see what that best uptake can be over time. Next slide. So after 5 years of doing that, you can now see that into the future we've become a bit more efficient, and we've got some our partners are still keen to go with gantries. They like the fact that they know when the baits are out, and they know when the baits are taken, and they know when the baits are removed. And on our properties and some of our partnership properties, we've moved to doing ground baiting, because you can get a higher number of baits into the ecosystem, and we know that uptake is increased when there's more baits available out there. So we still have high levels. We have a combination effect of baits out there and different ways to deliver that in a strategic way. We also do trapping, different sorts of trapping, a little bit of cage trapping, mostly leg hold trapping. And we've been using technology to try and expand that trapping program. The celium trap technology now gives you alert systems so that you can actually reliably understand what's going on with a bigger number of traps. Next slide. And we know that there's bait shy animals out there, so that's why we use trapping and things like Felix grooming traps to try and get those bait shy animals under control. If you haven't heard of Felix grooming traps before, they rely on sensors to detect the shape of the animal, and then they'll shoot a toxic gel using 1080 at the animal, and then the animal grooms it off. Next slide. And there's just a summary of the results from the grooming traps in terms of the number of cats and foxes now that the device can detect and fire upon. So as a static trap, they are relatively successful. And once you understand, again, where your predators are actually moving in the landscape, you can really target where you put these devices and move them around through different properties. Next slide. As Tom alluded to, we actually have a big group called the conservation shooters that come down and stay at our field station and actively shoot on our neighbours' properties through the year. So you can just see the sheer numbers that they can knock off over a weekend is pretty impressive. One thing to note, though, is that feral cats are trickier to shoot in the landscape, but you certainly knock off a lot of foxes. Next slide. And I guess apart from doing all the work in terms of controlling things, we want to try and track what are those numbers doing in terms of the predators, and B, is our native fauna recovering, which is the whole premise of the project. So we were using cameras to detect this, and I guess one of the learnings was that we had initially looked at a backy type design, before after control impact type design, but when you have treatment and control cameras, sometimes we found that in those control areas there was people doing control work, so they're less of a control activity than what you think. So going into the future, we've decided that we're just going to have a year-round array looking at landscape scale changes, lured on camera on tracks, rather than trying to get a treatment control. As I alluded to, what did we learn in a nutshell? We did a lot of camera work, and some cameras are really useful to detect some things, but cats still, we get very low detections of cats. They're quite neophobic, and I think it's one of the tricky things with cats is actually getting enough detections to be able to detect when you're actually having an impact. But overall, there is just no silver bullet. The detections are very low. We know that all those trap techniques can capture cats and kill cats in low numbers. and bait uptake can be quite variable depending on what alternate prey is out there. But we are using the cat targeted bait, the Eradicat bait, which is the 4.5 milligram bait now. And that's the best available bait out there for cats. And foxes, it turns out. So foxes readily take baits. They, as you can see, they are readily can be trapped and shot, and are quite open to walking into static device traps as well. So our fox results were significantly better in that we were definitely having a knockdown, but the reinvasion rates seem to be quite high. So it just means that we need to keep going and keep knocking off fox populations, but also it's really important to work in a much bigger area and find landscape scale solutions. And as Tom alluded to, if we can get these giant regional solutions, we can really start to have an impact. And lastly, rabbits. Rabbits, obviously, there is no silver bullet. We did some targeted work on rabbits. And overall, I think, again, rabbits is just a continual knockdown using the calicivirus, which is available out there. We have naturally flowing around calicivirus, and it seems to be better when it naturally hits the area than when you actually release it. We've also tried 1080 bait oating, but the most effective way is really to fumigate warrens, rip warrens, and you get a much longer lasting result. Just a little case study on tammars, because they are in that prey size, critical rate range mammal size, but we did have some positive outcomes with our monitoring around tammars. We saw more in terms of it. There was an increased occupancy over time. We saw them in places that we hadn't seen them before, and it just really flags that we're starting, after 5 years of this work, we're really starting to see the recovery of some of these critical rate range species. Next slide. And whilst the camera data doesn't show recovery across all of our native species, because they are very low numbers in the landscape, we definitely have seen increased malleefowl sightings, new Mondrobut mounds being detected. We talked about populations of tammars being detected. We've had 4 sightings now on cameras, which may seem quite not that much, but it's quite significant in this landscape where they haven't been seen for a number of years. And the dibblers, which had been released on one of those state-owned reserves, Peenia, was released there about 10 years ago and hadn't really been detected much since the release, has finally been detected last year. So once you get these integrated pest management programs in place for a number of years in time, you actually start to detect these observational, wins or hopes that you can actually make a difference in reversing that trend. So beyond June 2026, we actually will have limited funds to continue, but we will be continuing the program regardless. But look, I just think it's a fantastic case study of once you get people working together, it's great, and to keep that momentum going is really important. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Tom.
No, I think you've summed it up nicely. I think that the concept of the priority place is really starting to show that it works. I think everybody in the NRM world has always understood that you have to look at the whole landscape, and you have to work with all partners across all tenures. A point I feel like we've made pretty well, Heather. So I think that's all from us. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Tom. It's a great presentation. Fantastic to see such long-term and continuous work being conducted in a really critical part of the world from a biodiversity perspective. So thank you very much for that presentation. So lastly, we're going to hear a positive control outcome relating to weeds with Peter Ridgeway, who I mentioned earlier, is from the Local Land Services working on grassy box woodlands. And he's going to present on the return of threatened flora and fauna species resulting from the control of invasive native blackthorn. So thanks, Peter. Over to you.
Cheers. Let's see if we can get the screen sharing working for everyone. So afternoon, everyone. So I'm Pete Ridgeway, work mostly on grassy box woodland systems, so particularly the Cumberland Plain woodland just west of Sydney, looking at both flora and fauna recovery, and just going to present some really simplified view of a program we've been doing for about 3 years into a 15-year program out there, looking at an invasive native plant species, and some of the interesting outcomes from that, which hopefully will be applicable to a few other regions as well. So acknowledging I'm coming off Darug country today, being very heavily involved in this project with the local Darug community as well, through a number of processes, but particularly in terms of cultural fire and getting that back into our landscape. So we'll touch on that a little bit, but just to start off with acknowledging our respect for the elders, past, present, and emerging. For those of you who don't know the region, so Cumberland Plain, mostly rural region, just west of Sydney, less of it every year, as you can imagine from the context. Very similar to the Western Slopes in New South Wales or other grassy box woodland systems across Australia. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the landscape change, why we do have a problem with particular native species, the monitoring and research and the techniques being used on overabundant native scrub, and some of the initial outcomes that we're starting to see come out of these large-scale operations. So for historical context, quite similar to a number of other grassy box systems, we've got both good Indigenous and historical knowledge on the vegetation structure of this region from the past, which was very open. When people talk in some of the various historic quotes about driving a horse and cart through some of these grassy box woodlands, there was no exaggeration. Governor Macquarie took a horse and cart from the edge of the colony at Parramatta all the way to Penrith, which is about 20, 30 k's, through completely unsettled Aboriginal managed land in a horse and gig with no problems whatsoever. So we're talking about systems that were very, very structurally open at the time of colonisation, and a number of now threatened flora and fauna species which are heavily reliant on that vegetation structure. Very few patches still look like this. This is one of the rare examples. So pretty typical. This is Eucalyptus mollicana, Eucalyptus triaticornis, grassy box woodland. Very grass-dominated system. This is an ungrazed patch, hasn't been grazed for about 100 years, this particular patch. So this is as close as we get to a reference ecosystem, and chock full of your usual suspects of threatened flora and fauna for grassy box systems. So a number of small herbs, Palmyra spicata, formerly Swainsonias, etc. in the herb layer. And in our fauna, we've got a suite of endangered microbats, squirrel gliders, and so forth. By contrast, almost all of our region looks pretty much like this now, which is post-farming regrowth, very dense sapling tree growth, all even age stands, and very, very much impenetrable with overabundant regrowth of this particular native species, Bursaria spinosa, Blackthorn. In other regions, a perfectly well-behaved plant, occasional thickets down in gullies, now taken over probably around, don't know, anywhere from the high hundreds of thousands to maybe 1 million hectares, which pretty much look like this. Very, very heavily impacting on native ground covers and contributing to erosion risk, but also associated with declines in number of threatened flora species in particular, so Palmyra spicata, one of our small native Palmyra species, which are basically outcompeted, outshaded by this plant that does very well in the post-disturbance landscape. So up to date, haven't really been any very large scale or very well researched projects looking at control of this species. And so we entered a project doing so. We came with a few questions on our mind, which was really what's going to happen to our native ground covers, particularly looking at soil health there, and accessing shading, native birds, the potential that there might be some negative impacts from losing nesting habitat for native bird species, and also looking at our native fauna. So the project we've been doing this through is funded from Western Sydney Airport, but they've put up a large bucket of money for remediation as part of a biodiversity offset on some adjoining land. So we've got a 990 hectare site at Orchard Hills, just south of Penrith, and a little bit west of Sydney. And one of the key activities under that plan is the management of overabundant native blackthorn scrub, developed quite specific targets, being an offset project. And we've got about 15 years or so to roll out the program. So we've wrapped quite a bit of research. But firstly, to give a bit of a view for those who haven't been involved in any of these type of programs, what this looks like in practice. So we've been doing a combination of machine and hand thinning. You can see a before and after here of quite how transformative some of this invasive native scrub management programs can be. So we are looking at very substantial changes to the landscape, and they're control programs that do need to be taken very seriously in terms of what those side effects might be. Another case showing you here the before and after is quite a substantial transformation. In our case, we've left small pockets. You can see one in the middle of the frame here of around 5 metres squared, and we're spacing them every 50 metres or less through the landscape. So this is not an elimination program. This is very much a program about increasing the structural diversity of ecosystems by reducing overabundant species, which are blanketing systems and leading to structural change. So very important to note, we're not eradicating these species. We're moving them from a 99% cover in many cases down to much more manageable levels. If it works, I'll show a quick film to show the process sped up nicely. So brush cutters, physical removal, it's quite a physically intensive process, and each individual shrub needs to get treated. And there you go, all our little native coming in to make use of it immediately after. So, and then very importantly, management to prevent reincursion is really about getting fire back into this landscape. So we've got a very large cultural fire program, or rather 2 programs running with local Darra community and also with Fire Sticks, who's an Indigenous crew from Queensland, Victor Stephenson's group, and getting very regular burns back into these areas post-thinning. Wrapped around this is a large research project. Not my intention to go into this in detail today, but for anyone who's interested, watch this space, and happy to link people in as some of this research starts to mature over the next 5 to 10 years. And we've got both looking at some growth in terms of trees and shrubs and some direct measures of that, looking at how the work changes grazing pressure, and then having a look at individual elements of the ecosystem, invertebrates, birds, reptiles, microbats, flora, and some mixed species research trials. So hoping to probably get a couple of dozen research papers around what these type of transformations cause in terms of positive and negative effects in landscapes, which I hope will be useful both for invasive native species management programs and also for invasive species programs where we're making large-scale changes to landscapes. So sharing some very draft results to start with. So firstly, just in terms of the effectiveness, here we're looking at percentage of ground cover. So where we're looking at 10% ground cover, that's basically impenetrable, can't see anything. Densities, taking that down by just over 2/3. So quite substantial reductions, similar to what he showed there in the images. And those changes are persisting, which is exactly what we've been hoping to achieve. Curiously, we expected to see some fairly rapid ground cover changes, and so far, just 1 year after our initial control, we've seen relatively little change for good or worse in that sphere. So we have seen some small improvements, about 2 or 3% of our ground covers increasing post-control. We're anticipating that will increase over time. We have seen fairly similar reductions in the cryptograms, and that seems to be a result of green pick really taking over more so than soil crust in these areas that have had a lot of canopy cover in a grassy box woodland context for a long time. So we're starting to see a bit of those initial shifts taking place in the floras. Where the surprising and very, very rapid changes have been in the fauna, particularly for microbats. So for those not familiar, Australia has a suite, depending on your region. Most grassy box woodland regions of Australia have 4 or 5 open woodland specialist microbat species, and they're almost all going to be found on your local and, in many cases, your national threatened species lists. So Scodianax, for example, in our case here, and these are species that are adapted to structurally open systems. We didn't expect to see a lot of change in microbats since we're treating a native shrub species, but we saw dramatic uses. This graph, so left is before thinning and right is after thinning. And unfortunately here, blue means high activity. I didn't do this. This is from State Forest Research Centre, so apologies for the reversal of the normal red being lots. So you can see before control in a little research square here, you can see this is a heat map of activity rates across an area of about 100 metres squared. And you can see that small openings effectively in the shrub cover there were associated with higher activity in the northeast and northwest corner of that plot. And what happened pretty much immediately with a matter of weeks of control was to see microbat activity for those target species increase multiple times over. Not only in the specific portions of those plots that we thinned, but right across the area. So we're seeing some population level activity changes very rapidly occurring as a result of the structural changes from our vegetation management. This is very much unexpected, and it's very interesting and very positive for us thinking about other ways of managing threatened species. Very quickly covering the birds, we expected to see some fairly straightforward changes in bird fauna. What we have seen to date, still going through more detailed analysis, has been very complicated changes in our bird fauna. So we did see some pretty immediate increases in certain woodland species. The migratory species certainly seem to be the most impacted, so scarlet robin in particular, and this seems to be related to the ability of bird guilds to change. So migratory birds, when you change the conditions, can arrive in much larger numbers. They see what they like, they stay on this particular site longer, whereas resident bird populations may well be taking many years to gradually build up, breed, and so on. We did see some changes in striated pardalote. We also did see some minor but statistically significant increases in noisy miner. This is a species that's very interesting to manage. There's plenty of recommendations out there for how you can very effectively reduce noisy miner control by planting really thick shrubbery. The problem with that is that you additionally push out noisy miners and all your other grassy box specialist birds, including your target threatened species. So that's a species that needs a little bit more close watching. So that's a very high level overview of a rather large and complicated project, but hopefully planting the seed that some of these large scale weed management and invasive native management programs can have some fairly profound flow-on effects, even in the short term, and really worth thinking through some of these for those larger scale programs that are being run. And a very long list of acknowledgements for the different people involved in this program.
Thanks, Pete. That's an amazing story and some fantastic numbers there in terms of the recovery that's occurring. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our presenters, Rob and Tom and Heather as well. Really appreciate your giving up a bit of time. We will move on now to our open discussion period with a bit of Q&A. So we've had one question that's come through the chat. Just a reminder, you can either drop it in the chat, or if you'd like to put up your virtual hand and ask a question as well, that is fine. But Pete, for you, we've had a question from Stephen Thompson from LLS around what is the process for gaining approval to remove and control Blackthorn?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's actually a complicated one. For our program, that's been very simple because we're not in New South Wales, we're on Commonwealth land. So, and we've got a specific EPBC Act approval, which also went through as part of the offset program through the New South Wales approvals under the BC Act. So it's come through different pathway because of being a federal land and a biodiversity offset, come through a different pathway to most programs. At the moment, there's a bit of legislative lack of clarity, to be honest, around managing that species. The normal for New South Wales would be to get a harm permit for the endangered ecosystem that you're working with. So in this case, Cumberland Plain woodland through New South Wales DQ. That is a little bit clunky because the Biodiversity Conservation Act doesn't really set itself up for that, but New South Wales DQ will issue licenses for it. So national parks have also done a program managing Bursaria spinosa, which they referenced voluntarily through New South Wales DQ, and that was also the advice that was received on that one. So it hasn't been too difficult, and thankfully we've got a couple of projects by government agencies that have been doing this, so it provides a little bit of confidence when applying for permits to do it elsewhere. We've found other people have gone through the process pretty smoothly.
Great, and hopefully with the positive news story that you guys are, presenting, that might make it easier. So, great, excellent. So Rob, a question for you from Susan Ivory from South Australia. Actually, I need to just go down because it popped out of my screen. So, if the second generation treatment or baits are banned for sale through retailers such as Bunnings, how do you envisage these products might be made available to farmers for, I guess, for more industrial use,
Yeah.
farming purposes?
No, great question. Thank you, Susan. Well, the good news is farmers are probably the least users now of these products. Most of them use zinc phosphide and quite alternative products that have they do have a high risk of primary exposure, but they have no secondary impact. So in fact, it's been quite positive, at least over here in Western Australia, with farmers switching to that. I'd also say, like as I said at the beginning of the talk, we're not against banning this for everyone, and I guess that I would advise judicious use, and I would advise complying with the regulations and the APVMA. We kind of fear that they're going to come out of this review and basically say follow the packet instructions, which are things like don't throw baits outside, put them in bait boxes. Some of those things help. Um, and I would say I'm actually really interested to know these alternatives that have come out, like Rat Sack Naturals and different products. How are they? Are they effective? It would be good to trial them. And I'm not going to pretend it's an easy solution. It is tricky. But I'd say, yeah, definitely be trying alternatives, first generation products, if you have to use anticoagulants.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Rob. And just sort of a follow on from Heather, she's sort of referring to, having
Mm.
conversations with neighbouring farmers around the broad scale use. And so you referenced some broad scale sort of alternatives there. Can you just
Yeah.
expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so most farmers now do tend to use zinc phosphide for broad scale use, and in fact, pretty sure that it is not permitted to use the products I'm talking about at broad scale level. I think that's actually banned. And so most broad scale users are pretty good with that. Zinc phosphide basically causes gases to expand in the stomach, and it's meant to be reasonably rodent specific. But look, I wouldn't want to have primary exposure to other animals, so everything
Okay.
kind of has its trade-offs, but it's kind of a pretty instant hit and drop thing with no risk of secondary poisoning. So I'd definitely be advocating those sort of products.
Yeah, okay, great,
Uh,
thanks.
and one on
Um,
Pindone too. Yes.
yeah, I think I think that we might throw that one to Heather or Tom in terms of the integrated control of rabbits. So yeah, can you talk and expand about your use of Pindone in terms of rabbit control within your integrated sort of work, Heather and Tom?
Yep, I can answer that one. We actually didn't use Pindone because it does have a risk to natives, whereas 1080 for us, we found that had a much lower risk, particularly when we use like rabbit tunnels. So we had quite direct and specific pre-feeding and feeding regimes when we did use 1080. So we didn't use Pindone, but maybe Rob can talk about Pindone in reference to his studies.
And I'll just do a quick 30-second recap. The interesting thing is we've never found any pindone in any levels we're concerned about in any animal we've looked at or any analysis out of hundreds of animals. But we are aware there are, excuse me, there are studies talking about poisoning impacts. So we're a little cautious, but I'm kind of confident enough to say it's not a widespread issue for us. Definitely, it is an anticoagulant rodenticide of concern. So, I'm a bit cautious, but interestingly, it's far from the main concern that we're finding.
Very good. Excellent. Um, so maybe Tom and Heather, I know that this integrated control of rabbits, foxes, and cats and getting all the timing of that right can be probably tricky. How did you find that in terms of the work that you guys have done?
Yeah, I can answer that one.
Go
So
for it, Heather.
a lot of the work that we did, we tried to piggyback. So when we'd be going out doing trapping, we'd be doing baiting, and we definitely have a works program across the year that's well planned. We've had now that's been running for 5 years. We've had a couple of really wet years and a couple of really dry years, and that really affects things like prey availability around when we do our baiting, and it also affects in the wet times accessibility to some areas because this area is at risk of dieback, and we try to not work in really wet conditions. So look, we have been affected in some years in terms of our program, but we always have a plan B, and we try and get everything done, within a reasonable time frame. So yeah, we've definitely learnt a lot in terms of operations, but that's how things run really.
Cool. Fantastic.
Probably the other
Okay,
larger
Tom.
scale thing to add to that, Justin, in regards to timing is, we've currently got no guarantee of continuation to keep that operation at that same scale.
Yeah.
So these, building new projects at the federal level, there's a timing piece that we've got to consider there, because the Fitzsterling region where the bush heritage properties are and all that work is completely porous. It's not an island or a peninsula, as you know. So the second we take our foot off the gas, the immediate infill. So there's timing at an operational level, and there's timing at the need to see that continued investment so that work doesn't go to waste.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Tom. It's a nice segue to give me a bit of a plug. One of the training areas that we're working on through the National Biosecurity Hub project is around providing some guidance on writing compelling funding applications for biosecurity control work. It was an area that the community of practice members identified as one of their training needs. So we're just in the process of trying to identify some providers for that to help with people wanting to write really, really excellent funding applications for killing things, which is not always the easiest thing to sell for some of those applications. So if people are interested in that, keep your eyes on our Slack channel and on our other feeds for that. Susan has asked, did you have to consider owned cat identification in your program? I think that's Heather or Tom for you guys. Do you want to go on a tirade about the cat laws in Western Australia and the legislation?
Heather, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, I guess every individual landholder that we talked to was different, and some of them do own cats, and dogs. So that's why we went for the tethered bait controlled approach. And every time we'd refresh rates and things, we'd be directly communicating with pet owners. And there's a level of responsibility then on them to make sure that their pets don't interact with baits. So look, I'm not going to delve into the cat ownership laws and the conversations that have been going on, but it's a consideration, and it definitely has brought it to light in the media recently that there is a number of pet cats and stray cats that are out there, and they actually reproduce and they cause problems for our natives. So that's at the crux of that conversation, really.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. And again, for those that are not aware, we have one of our members of the COP sits on the National Feral Cat Working Group. And I know some of these topics of discussion occur there. So if people want to engage in that, let us know. We can connect you with Andrew Dennis, who is our rep for NRM Regions Australia and the NRM space on that. So great. Pete, can I just come back to you? You spoke about leaving little islands of boxthorn in the cleared space that you have there. Can you explain, the reasoning around that? And does boxthorn have any sort of protective, does it provide any sort of protection for native species as well? Is there any, can you just, elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, yeah. So I put it on the first slide. A lovely, I can't remember which thornbill it was, but one of the thornbill species nesting in Bursaria. So this is one of the key considerations that often comes up, specifically about bird nesting for a whole range of both native and introduced weed species, particularly those mesic shrub species or thorny shrub species. Is, well, how do we maintain suitable bird breeding habitat? And we spoke to a lot of bird researchers and ended up sort of hitting on about a 5 metre buffers. So we created either linear corridors or little individual nodes of about 5 metres, based on the fact that from a large data set of birds nesting and a lot of personal experience from the local bird species, that they're really only ever nesting about 5 metres deep into some of this habitat. So we had a bit of a grip on what the spatial dimensions of some of that nesting habitat need was, and we were able to put that into the program. It was interesting to see. We didn't, obviously gave a very, very brief overview of the data, but didn't see any reduction in breeding activity at all. So we reduced across about 100 hectares of control. So a vast amount of material taken out of this landscape, and didn't see any reduction whatsoever in bird breeding by simply going from something that was overabundant in monoculture down to very small, about less than 5% of the surface area was left untreated in those 5 metre patches. So I think that it's about designing these control programs with some good metrics around what type of breeding habitat is needed, and that can be retained in very, very small pockets, as a relative proportion of the landscape, without any negative consequences at all. And like you saw, at least preliminary, some positive effects on some bird species. Like many things, with the right information, it can be managed in such a way that you can avoid those negative effects entirely. For weedy shrubs, there's some pros and cons of leaving those small nodes. If it's an invasive species, you may need to think about generating some of that habitat early on by native species, for example, before doing these large-scale transformative type weed management programs.
Yeah, really good point, Pete. And I think it's I remember we did a project when I was with South Coast on removing boxthorn, African boxthorn, from not far from where Heather's working, and we there were comments made that they are pretty good nesting habitats for birds and also for some of the fairies as well. And we did have that crisis of thought of wondering whether we were making things worse by taking out protective habitat rather than better. I think the sort of science that you're doing is it's probably really useful for that. As long as you say, you can control the woody weeds. That's the risk if you leave them in situ, isn't it? Or don't provide an alternative. So great, Rob. Just over to you. Like looking forward with your crystal ball, what alternatives are there out there for, and we were talking about domestic use, but for rodenticides, how can we move forward in this space?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is a wickedly difficult space. I always say I feel bad. I come to these talks saying, don't use this, but I don't have a solution, not a clear one. But it doesn't mean we should keep doing what we're doing. Look, I think there are some really good alternatives already, but they do have a high primary exposure risk, and cholecalciferol, which vets don't like this because there is no antidote. This is the problem. You can give vitamin K injections for things that ingest ARs, but not for some of these others, and the same with zinc phosphide. I'm excited by products like Rat Sac Naturals. They target the rodent's digestive system with a sort of a quirk of physiology. We're just hopefully trialing for the first time an island eradication is in the works at Penguin Island and perhaps at Rottnest using these products. So it'll be a first opportunity to see if they can be effective at scale. So some of those things have good hope, and what I really hope is, this worldwide push, the compelling evidence that's all in on how bad these products are, is going to facilitate a new research and development boom, hopefully, and that we shouldn't just keep accepting it. Basically, the companies I feel have got lazy; they haven't had to come up with an alternative.
Mm.
Because no one's kind of pushed back in a long time. But there's some of these companies, we're talking Bayer and Flick. We've got some of the world's richest companies here. So I'm sure they're up to the challenge, right?
Yeah, you'd hope so. Susan wants to know if there's a similar rat sac natural coming for rabbits.
Yeah, great question. I know the thing is wickedly difficult. Not at this stage, I guess, unfortunately, that I'm aware of. But
Yeah,
again, I think some good money in this for all of us if we change careers and try and formulate some new products that are more
yeah.
environmentally friendly.
And Rob, do you have any views on the potential and the likely success of gene drive in this space?
Yeah, look, that is exciting. The CRISPR stuff has shown good promise. The New Zealanders are quite far ahead of us in trialing some of this work. So I'm optimistic. The only where Australia gets let down a bit with all of these discussions we've just been having is we have a lot of native rodents, unfortunately, as in I'm glad we do, but we have very closely related species, whereas, other countries that's not always the case, and certainly many islands. So we have to be a bit careful, and that's probably where we might find it a bit of a struggle. How do you protect, pseudomies and notomies, all the native mice from these sort of approaches? And I don't know.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Look, thanks again to all of our presenters and your contributions through the Q&A of those watching online. Look, thank you again. We really appreciate everyone's attendance and your engagement in the biosecurity space. Wishing everyone a great break over the Christmas season, and hopefully you all come back refreshed to fight the good fight of dealing with biosecurity next year in 2026. So thank you very much, and have a great day.